when I'm watching the lecture video from Mr. Lopez, what really stuck out to me was the difference between street crime and white collar crime. We focus so much on robberies, assaults, theft, stuff like that. We get so much information about it, and it's for us to see. But bigger stuff, like companies stealing a lot of money, that stuff is more under wraps. And the big heads, corporate heads, do a lot to sort of cover that part up so you don't get a bad idea of the companies and stuff. And the, I just found it was interesting that we punish regular people harshly for smaller crimes, but elites that are big up can pay to get away with a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, I feel like it goes back to that lecture we had a few weeks ago about the like middle class kids and the lower class kids, about how some of them got like punished more often compared to maybe like the middle to upper class kids just because
Mhm.
of their background and how they like are known and labeled, I guess.
Definitely,
Yeah,
definitely.
I agree with that. And even to go into more of the difference between white collar crime and like street crime, one thing about white collar crime is there's a difference in who pays the price. So with street crime, obviously there can be like an individual impact. Like it's kind of like criminal to victim. And then with white collar crime, a lot of the time the victims are kind of like anybody that's not the 1%, so the 99%, or even taxpayers. Like a lot of the stuff that we talked about had to do with economics and money, and a lot of fraud happening, and that paid the price on people like us, like who are taxpayers, have to pay tax money. We have to suffer the consequences, and they don't really suffer the consequences. As for street crime, people do get punished and they have jail time, but for white collar defendants, they usually get away with it, or it's a very minimal punishment.
Definitely, definitely. Um, and when I was looking at my documentary, it focused a lot on the white collar, but more on the big corporate stuff with sorry, real quick, let me just go over my case study. Mine was on about the January 6th committee. It was a PBS documentary called We Learned What We Learned in the First Eight January 6th committee hearings. This documentary focused a lot on like the powerful political leaders trying to overturn the 2020 election. And it really opened my eyes up more about the elite deviance crimes, which the crimes happening on January 6th was more than just white collar citizens. It involved a lot of the top levels with the government. When Donald Trump claimed the election was rigged, his supporters, some split, some definitely were saying not agreeing with Trump when he was saying it was being rigged. So they sort of took a step back on the support with him. But then there was a lot of other supporters that doubled down with him and just made it worse with Trump and his lawyers pressuring state officials with their claims of a fraudulent election. And when there was no evidence to be found, Trump doubled down again and told his supporters that they were stealing the election from them, and they'll believe anything he says just because they trust him. That's the president. And then he had that famous line, we're going to walk down to the Capitol and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women." And although Trump never actually told them to attack the Capitol, he had all these people genuinely believing that the election was stolen from them. So of course they're not going to like that, and a lot of the supporters were very violent that day, and they were even planning on doing some public hanging of some of the government officials that were betraying Trump in their eyes. And another one was Mike Pence, the own vice president. He didn't agree with Trump when he was saying that it was rigged. So he didn't support him on that. And that sort of made all the Trump supporters against Mike Pence as well. And lastly, I'll just say the main bullshit that I learned from this was obviously it was bullshit that he was claiming that the election was rigged. And I would even argue that him claiming the election was rigged was possibly the biggest and most mainstream bullshit I've seen in my lifetime with the news. Um, and theory that of the theory of crime that fits this type of scenario, I would say, is conflict theory, which claims people with power can make and bend rules to protect themselves. And this isn't the first time we've seen people with power being able to protect themselves and have lawyers and such that can get them out of big moments. So, last thing I'll say is this was much bigger than street crime, and people in power committing crimes can do a lot worse for society than the small level street crime.
Yeah, that's some great insight. I definitely agree that uh, the January 6th riot was probably the biggest bullshit I've seen in the past couple of years. My documentary that I listened to was also based on a concept of distrust in a little bit of a different way. It wasn't really anything, well, it's tied with politics, but it wasn't anything that was necessarily having to do with elections. But Inside Job was a documentary that covered a global financial crisis that took place near 2008. How did that even start? Well, the Great Depression obviously happened several decades before that. After the Great Depression, the United States was able to recover financially from that. If anything, they kind of completely turned around. They were able to experience robust financial growth. So that means that investment banks were also making a lot of money, were also kind of booming at the time. And they also had very strict regulations because of that, kind of to prevent any chaos from happening. So they weren't allowed to speculate with depositor savings, and they weren't allowed to kind of engage in any risky activity, if you will. Um, but then that changed when President Reagan was in office. His administration kind of set a precedent of unregulated economic activity. So investment banks became public because of their growth and because of how much money and attention they were bringing. And that also gave them huge amounts from stockholder money. So a big difference between that time that I described during the Great Depression and when Reagan's administration took control is that they were speculating with depositors' money. As you can imagine, with a lot of money and only a small amount of people in control, that can create a lot of issues. A lot of the issues that resulted in that was a lot of risky investments that they were making with depositors' money. What was the result of that? Essentially, people were losing their savings, like their entire savings. They were losing a lot of money. They were becoming in debt. And people even ended up homeless and evicted. So that was the cost that they had to pay because investment banks were taking control of their money. I think during the documentary, what stood out to me the most was the lack of accountability. There were some people who went to jail, but there were some people that were even appointed like big positions by presidents after this happened and just completely exempt from whatever they did, which I think is something that happens now still. Even when you talked about the January 6th riot, I feel like that was fully exempted, unfortunately. So I think that kind of created a lot of distrust with the government. And I think just this precedent of not learning from consequences in white collar crime being more accepted. So those are my takeaways from my documentary.
Mine was actually about The Pharmacist. It's a series on Netflix. I thought it was pretty interesting. I only had to watch the third and fourth episode, but I honestly would probably go back and watch the first and second. But it's about Dan Schneider. His son died from an opioid overdose from oxycodone. It's an opioid, and it was like late 80s, early 90s, I believe. That was like the main. I don't know if you guys know, but did have a really high opioid issue in like the 90s, and a lot of it stemmed from pharmacists basically overdosing their patients. It started with Purdue Pharma. They were the ones who like kind of made OxyContin and praised it. They were like, oh, like this is an amazing like pain reliever, like and like um at like addiction percentages for that drug were super low. Like you weren't going to get addicted. It was amazing. Like everybody was using it, and they were kind of selling it as if they were like car salesmen, which I feel like was the first red flag that Dan realized. Dan was actually a pharmacist. He wasn't in law or anything, but he kind of was the one to start this whole investigation on Purdue Pharma with oxytocin or oxycodone. But the main person, like in the documentary, who was like basically killing their clients because they overdosed them on opioids was Dr. Clerget, I believe. She was a pharmacist, I believe in Louisiana. She only operated at night, which is like a dead giveaway that it's like a really shady thing. But she was providing like one example was like 100-pound kid was taking 80 milligrams twice a day of an opioid, which should have killed the person, honestly. I don't know how she like lived that long. But it was just a bunch of instances that she was abusing her power as like a pharmacist. And she prescribed over 180,000 pills at 10 pharmacies. And Purdue Pharma was also backing her up in the fact that they were saying that the oxycodone wasn't addictive like whatsoever. Like the chances of them getting addicted was like literally like they said it was probably zero. Um, so obviously many people were going there and many people were getting overdosed due to Dr. Clerget, and she just kept giving them back. Like they kept coming back and back and back for more prescriptions. And the DEA wasn't doing anything. Like nobody was taking this seriously. So it took about 2 or 3 decades for them to actually shut down Purdue Pharma. And so the main takeaway from this is that how much power doctors have just because they have a medical degree, and that we trust them with our whole hearts just because they went through a decade and a half of schooling, but they can still do bad, and it's like the biggest white collar crime out there.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting perspective. You had something that was kind of like not on the opposite side of the spectrum of me and Owen's documentaries, but ours was like a mix of political, and then I had more of on the economical political side, and then yours is healthcare. I think something very similar also happened with Xanax. That was another anxiety medication that was overly prescribed, highly addictive, and now it's not prescribed anymore, but it's just a case of like a medication that is dangerous, that can be unregulated or distributed in an unregulated way that has adverse effects on the population.
Yeah, and I just want to say I agree too with what you were saying about we just listen to the doctors because they have the degree and they're the experts in a way, even though multiple times it's shown that we shouldn't just automatically listen to them. Another scenario I found similar to yours was back then people were saying cigarettes were healthy, back in like the 60s or so, and because there wasn't much technology, or I mean, much like research that went out into it, but until later years when they realized we shouldn't be smoking this, because at the time doctors were prescribing it to people as a healthy way to get rid of pain, but in reality it was making everything worse. You know,
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, and I do remember, yeah, cigarettes, they definitely weren't seen as unhealthy as they are now. Even there are ways the government are trying to take initiative to get people to stop smoking cigarettes, like putting more tax money on the cost of them. So that's a solution they've come up with now. I think something that all of our documentaries have in common, definitely this theme of distrust and a lack of accountability. A lot of the people that were the perpetrators in a lot of our case studies were people who had a lot of privilege and a lot of money, and then taking of people who are essentially the opposite, and not even just the opposite, but just not like elite, if that
Mhm.
makes sense.
Yeah, I agree.
I don't know about the aftermath for your guys's, but I know mine caused a big shift in the DEA where they were like realizing how often this could be happening without like them noticing. And so like I feel like after this whole issue went down, the DEA really honed in and locked in on um I guess like fixing the issue.
Yeah, I feel like for my documentary, unfortunately, we still kind of face the consequences of what happened. I think that's like one of the big, the timer went off. I think that's one of the big differences with like yours and mine thing, because now like a lot of the people that were involved in that financial crisis are still in office today.
And real quick, ours, when I look at the results of what happened on January 6th, so many people got in trouble for that at the time. But then just this past year, every single person was pardoned for the events, which I just, on a different subject, don't agree with, but that's getting a bit off subject. But um, I don't see a lot of um, learning from this as we should for how bad it was, but part of that is just due to what the politics are right now, so